This is New Patreon Series number 49, Part 2. We're going to discuss the classic Merkabah ascents of Yeshua, Paul, and Mary Magdalene. Yeshua taught a form of Merkabah ascent, and there's evidence that he instructed his disciples in a secret form of Jewish prophetic meditation called shakad, or keeping watch. In the New Testament, all the sayings about watch are probably originating in this kind of a direction. Mishkad, from which we get the word shakad, was a means of Jewish Merkabah ascent through the 7 or the 10 Shemayim, the heavenly eternities, the Olamim. And here I've put just a little graphic of the Enochian 10 heavens that we've seen before. But I'm going to turn it upside down because we're talking about ascent, and when ascent is talked about, we go from the lowest heaven to the highest heaven. Now, the goal of Shakad was to learn the Ratzim HaMalkuth HaShemayim, what is translated in the New Testament as the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but literally it's the Ratzim, the secret knowledge of the sovereignty of the heavens, plural. The so-called Transfiguration event, as I've pointed out in a previous presentation, was probably a shakad, a Merkabah shakad. And it was probably a form of Merkabah ascent to the third heaven. In Luke's account, the following important details suggest that it was a Merkabah Mishkad event. Peter and his companions were drowsy, but when they became fully awake, that's a very important term, it's a technical term, they saw Yeshua's glory, or kavod, the splendor and light surrounding the throne of Godhead, and the two men standing with him, Moses and Elijah, and a cloud, that's always clouds in the sky and a rainbow and so on are always symbols of Merkabah events. A cloud appeared, and the word cloud probably refers to the Kabbalistic veils of primordial light that hide the face of Godhead. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my best one." The term is Bachar, my chosen, tested, or approved, or beloved one. Listen to him. Now, the three disciples with whom Yeshua shared the so-called Transfiguration experience were all given initiatic names. Shimon, who we would translate as Simon, was given the name Kephas, which means rock, and that became translated in the Greek New Testament as Petros, rock, Peter, rock. But his name was Simon, Shimon. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were called Boanerges. I mean, it's literally is a voice of thunder, but they were both very powerful proclaimers of Yeshua's basar, or so-called gospel, about the coming of the new humanity. And in fact, James, the brother of John, was beheaded by Herod Agrippa because of his preaching, which was very powerful, and he went by himself into villages and towns and was considered to be a threat politically to Herod Agrippa. So he had him beheaded. And that's the reason, by the way, that John, his brother, took the mother of Jesus and Mary Magdalene with him and went to Asia Minor to escape and set up synagogues there, messianic synagogues. Now, Mary was also given the initiatic name Magdala, which means tower of strength, which is implying that she had also experienced the ascent, as in the Gospel of Mary. So we're going to look at that. Now, ascents into the heaven, or the heavens, were not just discussed in terms of Jewish Merkabah mysticism, but there were many Hellenistic accounts of ascents to heaven that were not Jewish accounts. And in the Hellenistic milieu, there was a lot of overlap between these things. Pythagoreans influenced Babylonian Jews and their concepts of mysticism and so on. So there are also examples of this type of ascent to heaven in non-Jewish Christian materials, and perhaps the clearest is Cicero's report of the dream of Scipio Africanus in his Republic. The text was highly influential and functions as a kind of universal declaration of the gospel of astral immortality. Scipio travels to the heavenly world above and returns with a revelation that all humans are immortal souls, trapped in mortal bodies, but potentially destined for heavenly life above. The Gnostic text Poimandres, which is found in the Corpus Hermeticum, also fits this category of ascent. There is also an important text in the Greek magical papyri mistakenly called the Mithras liturgy. It provides the initiate who desires to ascend to heaven with an actual guide for making the journey with all of its dangers and potentials, with magical formulas and so on. And there are Jewish texts, such as the Hekalot Rabbati, which have strong parallels with such magical materials, showing that we're dealing here with an international phenomenon of late antiquity, as Morton Smith said in 1963. Because even in the Jewish descriptions of the Hekalot ascent and descent, in which people are called not just ascenders to heaven, but also descenders to the chariot, there are all kinds of magical directions and things that go along with that as well. So it's likely that the rites of initiation into certain of the so-called mystery religions, such as that of Isis, also involved that kind of an experience of ascent to heaven. For example, Apuleius's Metamorphoses talks about that kind of an ascent. It's noteworthy that Paul's testimony in 2 Corinthians is our only first-hand autobiographical account of such an ascent from the Second Temple period, and it is an ascent that is very experiential. So let's take a look at Paul's ascent to the third heaven, which we find in 2 Corinthians 12, 1-6. We've examined this before in a previous presentation, but there's some things I want to point out. Paul is defending his claim to be an apostle, even though he had never been a disciple of Yeshua. Secret Merkabah experience was considered in early Christianity to be evidence of divine initiation and apostleship, as it was in the later Gnostic revelations. So he says, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up, that means ascended, to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Now, he is not saying I was caught up. I had this revelation. He was saying, I know a man in Christ. The reason for that is that it was in the first century considered to be impious for anyone to discuss Merkabah experience with somebody else who had not had the experience. In other words, to make public the secret knowledge and the secret experience was considered to be not cricket at all. So he doesn't say, I had this experience. He says, I know a man in Christ, because he wants to get the word out that he's had this experience without being accused of having named himself and told this. Now, the third heaven, which contained the Pardes, or paradise, as well as the Gehenna, it would be the place where James, John, and Peter saw Moses and Elijah speaking with Jesus, and the place where Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was contemporary with Yeshua, dreamed of sharing the messianic or marriage banquet with his elect, the highest third-class disciples that we discussed in the previous presentation, the saints, the ones who were worthy of these visions. Now, the Pardes is where the Kabbalistic rabbis mystically met to study Torah on the Sabbath. So Paul is saying that he's gone to this place and heard these things. And I know this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to the third heaven of paradise, says Paul. And in the Enochian scheme of the 10 heavens used by Yeshua and his disciples, both the Pardes, paradise, and Gehenna, or purgatory, existed in the third heaven. He, meaning I, Paul, heard inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I'd be speaking the truth. Here he's defending his right to reveal in this convoluted way that he's had this experience. Now, back in the 1970s, the Catholic scholar Raymond Brown released a publication that he had developed called The Community of the Beloved Disciple, in which he talked about the key role of Mary of Magdala, or Mary Magdala, Mary Tower of Strength, and the development of church leadership in Ephesus and really in Asia Minor. So I'm going to show you what he said in that rather groundbreaking document. So he says that in John's Gospel, the one who's called the beloved disciple, and by the way, it's a male term, is actually a veiled reference to Mary Magdalene. And he says in the first stage of this development in Asia Minor, from the mid-50s to the late 80s of the first century AD, the originating group of the community is led by Mary Magdalene. She's highly esteemed as the primary witness to the resurrection of Christ. She's recognized as such even by believers who do not belong to this particular community. She is known very early on as the companion of Jesus and the disciple whom Jesus loved. An essential part of their proclamation of the gospel is the fact that Mary Magdalene was the first to see the risen Christ. In the second stage, which she says occurs about AD 80 to 90, at this point the community has a version of their gospel, either written or oral, which includes the tradition that Mary Magdalene was their founder and hero and leader. Mary Magdalene is probably deceased by this time, as would be also Mary, the mother of Jesus, both of whom had traveled to Asia Minor with John the Apostle. There's a schism in the community, which is most likely the result of an internal dispute about the high Christology that Mary Magdalene has channeled and brought through. The community is divided into two groups, which Brown calls the secessionists and the apostolic Christians. Now, in this third stage, AD 90 to 100, of the apostolic Christians, Brown says, as the church becomes a more organized institution, this group is fearful of ostracism and persecution. They seek amalgamation with the leaders of the emerging institutional church. The claim that a female disciple of Jesus had been their community's first leader and hero quickly becomes an embarrassment. They need to obscure that fact if they are to be accepted by the male leadership of the growing organized church. A redactor in this community reworks their gospel in order to make it consistent with this obscuration. The result of this redaction is the canonical fourth gospel as we have it today, which refers to the beloved disciple anonymously, but which Brown says is a reference to Mary Magdalene. Now, concerning the secessionists, Brown says they're the largest of the two groups. They hold on to their tradition, which cites Mary Magdalene as the beloved disciple of Jesus. Many members of this community take the tradition to various Gnostic groups. Their identification of Mary Magdalene as the disciple whom Jesus loved is reflected in the Gnostic Christian writings of Nag Hammadi, for example, the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary, where Mary Magdalene is called the companion of Jesus and the beloved disciple, etc. So this is what he says. I put a little icon of Karen King's really good translation and description of the Gospel of Mary, where we have a description of an ascent, of a Merkabah ascent to the heavens of Mary Magdalene. Now I'm going to give you the Lewis Kaiser version of Mary Magdalene and the evolution of church leadership in Ephesus and in Asia Minor, because this is what I think happened, and this is, of course, many years after Raymond Brown's idea was first put out. In the first stage, about AD 44 to 49, the young apostle John brought both Mary, the mother of Yeshua, and Mary Magdalene to Ephesus after John's brother, the evangelist James, was beheaded by Herod Agrippa. It was time for them to get out of the Palestine area because there was a big persecution against the evangelizers of Messianic Judaism. So they went to Asia Minor where there was not such a persecution. Now, Mary Magdalene had witnessed the empty tomb, as we had in the original version of Mark's Gospel, which is makes her still a witness to the resurrection, but not in the way that it was later presented in Luke and so on, and the traditions of 80, 85, 90, and so on. Now, her visions, however, she was a visionary. She had witnessed the empty tomb, and she had experienced many visions of the risen Yeshua. And that's probably the source of the later ideas that she saw Jesus in the garden and thought he was a gardener at first and talked to him and so on. Her visions were instrumental in the development of Johannine Christology. So I would maintain that her views and visions of Jesus as divine, as something like almost co-equal to God, were instrumental in the development of the Johannine Christology that we know from the fourth gospel. So here's one representation at the foot of the cross of the Apostle John and Mary Magdalene. And the Apostle John is taken by given a direction according to the Johannine description to take care of the mother of Jesus, and he and Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, go and travel to Asia Minor, where they begin speaking and giving the gospel of Yeshua into the Messianic, into the Jewish synagogues that existed there, where Messianic Judaism is introduced. They don't found churches. They are working with Jewish congregations at this point. Nothing has been decided about Gentiles. That's something that Paul comes up with later in AD 49. But so this trio, John and the two Marys, go to Asia Minor, and where they teach and preach in the synagogues. Now, remember what Mary's experience had been, at least according to the Gospel of Mark, the original version of the Gospel of Mark that was available in the first century. They had experienced an empty tomb with what literally translated as a young man, meaning an angel, sitting there and saying that Jesus isn't here, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. And so they're spooked and they run away from the cave. And that is the probably the original experience, not of seeing the risen Jesus, but of experiencing the fact that Jesus is no longer in that tomb. His body's no longer there. And that meant a great deal in Judaism, because the bodies of the greatest leaders had disappeared. The bones of Moses were nowhere to be found. What was done usually is the bones of a great patriarch or whoever it was in Judaism were collected and they were put in a certain place, and that became a shrine where people would come and worship and could have contact with the divine. But there were no bones for Moses. There were no bones for Elijah. And here there are no bones for Jesus. He's reckoned to be among that category of the highest of the Jewish saints, because the tomb is empty. Now, on a second stage, from about AD 49 to 70, Mary Magdalene and John were not present for the Jerusalem Council in AD 49, when James, a brother of Yeshua, as opposed to one of the sons of Zebedee, the brother of John, who had been martyred by that time. But in AD 49, when James, a brother of Yeshua, gave Paul rules for his Gentile churches, there were no real authorization for Gentiles to become Christians before that time. So the reason that Mary and John weren't there is they were occupied with teaching in the synagogues of Asia Minor. Now, when Paul came to Ephesus in AD 52, a few years later, he founded the Gentile churches separate from the Jewish Messianic communities of John and Mary. Significantly, Paul does not include Mary among his list of apostles who had visions of the resurrected Yeshua in the Corinthian correspondences. In fact, it's only males that he says have had these visions. But in fact, in Asia Minor, it was Mary Magdalene who had these visions. Now, it wasn't until 30 years later in the Luke Acts document that she was recognized as the first witness to the resurrection. The Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, both died in Ephesus about AD 70 and were buried very close to Ephesus. Later, their bones were recovered, and bones that were attributed to Mary Magdalene still exist in certain sanctuaries in Spain and other places. And those that are attributed to Mary, the mother of Jesus, also have been gathered centuries later, supposedly, and put into a place for veneration. Now, in a third stage, which is about AD 70 to 100, the Pauline and the Johannine congregations of Asia Minor have merged into what Brown calls the Apostolic Christians. The churches of Asia Minor adopt the male-only leadership of the emerging Western churches. The fact that a female disciple of Jesus had been one of their community's first and most influential leaders goes by the wayside. The canonical fourth gospel attributed to John is composed by several editors. Whether the beloved disciple is supposed to be John, it is a male term, or supposed to be Mary Magdalene. We don't know if Brown's thesis is correct. It's not very widely accepted. In the fourth stage, which is from the 2nd century to the 6th centuries, the figure of Mary Magdalene is conflated with the figure of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, the place where they both lived in Ephesus, the home of the two Marys, and also their deaths, are remembered as the house of Mary, the mother of Jesus, although in some traditions it's still called the house of Mary Magdalene, and also the place where the mother of Jesus experienced her dormition, that is, when she had a holy death and was her soul was received up into heaven and so on. But that might also have been early attributed to Mary Magdalene. So the Magdalenic oral traditions are preserved only in the Gnostic writings. Well, here's a picture of the what is supposed to have been the home or the place in Ephesus where Mary Magdalene and also Mary, the mother of Jesus, stayed. And you can still visit it. It's a tourist site. And this is a representation of the ascents of Mary Magdalene. That golden crown above her head is a representation of the throne of God, the Merkabah of God. And she's seen as rising from the earth up through the heavens and the heavenly places to ascend to the throne of God, the Merkabah experience. So let's summarize some of what I've been saying. Mary Magdalene was the visionary behind the Johannine mysticism of the Gospel of John. She was much older than the Apostle John. She was the age of Yeshua's mother, and she was a close disciple of Yeshua and one who was deeply respected. And she also was subject to visions and had visions of various kinds. She may have been the, quote, male beloved disciple of John's gospel, fourth gospel. But there's no way to really know that, and that is a speculative thesis. Now, according to Acts, she left for Asia Minor and Ephesus with John and Mary, the mother of Jesus, about AD 44, after James, a brother of John, had been beheaded by Herod Agrippa. And that legend of the two Marys and John coming to Asia Minor is a very old legend also in among the churches of Asia Minor and in Greek Orthodoxy. Now there, John and Mary Magdalene established the Messianic Johannine Jewish synagogues. They spoke to the synagogues, the Jewish people. There was no going to the Gentiles yet. Paul hadn't achieved that, and Paul hadn't started that ministry at this point. It was basically a ministry to synagogues, Jewish synagogues, about Yeshua and his Basor. So John and Mary Magdalene established these. Now, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was not a disciple of Jesus. She was not versed in the teachings of Yeshua, and she was not an evangelist, and she didn't go around and speak and teach. It was Mary Magdalene who did that. But in Greek Orthodox legend, Mary Magdalene is conflated with Mary, the mother of Jesus, probably because early male-dominated Christianity deemed it to be wrong for a woman to preach, as Pauline and pseudo-Pauline epistles had said or been spun to say. We do not allow a woman to speak in church, and so on. So Mary Magdalene, Miriam Magdala, Mary, the Tower of Strength, experienced her own ascent into the heavens daily, according to the medieval golden legends that connected her to earlier Christian Merkabah experiences, as in the Gospel of Mary. So the idea of ascent into the heavens was connected in legend from the earliest times and taken way into the medieval times with the figure of Mary Magdalene, and that the ascensions of the stories of Mary Magdalene coming to France and establishing a residence there for her and supposedly the daughter that was produced by her sexual liaison with Yeshua, which is not historical, but is just another legend. All that is legendary. She did not go to France. She didn't travel there. She lived and preached and did her work in Asia Minor. There's also legends that have her going to Rome to speak to the emperor and so on. These are not historical either, in my opinion. Now, according to the legends of the golden legends in France, God's angels came down 7 times a day and transported her, Mary Magdalene, up to where she could hear the celestial music of heaven, and then carried her back to her grotto, which was carved in the rock. That cave that she supposedly lived in is maintained and is now a site for veneration, and is kept by uh, by the nuns at that location in Balma, in the cave. And it was there that she supposedly had these ascensions, and these ascended into the heavens and so on. And the angels took her up. And this is a photograph of what the cave, which is now a sanctuary and has a huge church inside and an altar and a sanctuary and so on, at Balma. That's what that looks like now. So let's examine Mary's ascent in the Gospel of Mary and compare it to the Hermetic ascent in the Poimandres, because the two are quite comparable.
So now let's compare what we find in the Gospel of Mary with the Hermetic ascent through the harmony of the spheres. Now, the place where this kernel of what may be apostolic gnosis or initiatic gnosis begins is actually she's already into the process. She's come to the second, or she's speaking to the second olam, or the second space or place or world. And the word here that is used is desire. It seems that all of this is related very much to the overcoming of one's passions and desires, and so this word is used rather generally. And desire, which is the name of this second element, said, I did not see you descending, but now I see you ascending. Why do you lie, since you belong to me? And the soul, that's the soul of Mary Magdalene, answered and said, I saw you. You did not see me nor recognize me. I served you as a garment, and you did not know me. And when the soul of Mary Magdalene, said this, it went away rejoicing greatly. It was free. In other words, it was able to pass through this region and go on to a higher level. Again, it came to the third power, which is called ignorance. The power questioned the soul, saying, where are you going? In wickedness are you bound? But you are bound. Do not judge. And the soul said, why do you judge me, though I have not judged? And then goes on to give her defense, which is going to free her. This is missing. We don't have the rest of these words, but we have the words that come right after. When the soul had overcome the third power, it went upwards and saw the fourth power, which took 7 forms. Now this fourth power that took 7 forms can be related to the elemental of fire. We've been through earth, water, and air. Now we're dealing with fire. And these 7 forms we'd expect to be the astrological forms, the moon and Mercury and Venus and so on. But what we get is something that's a little bit stranger than that. It's maybe a kind of it's a 7-fold thing, but it doesn't quite seem to fit as we understand them with the planets. But if we look into Jewish astrology and the early Kabbalistic astrology, we may get more clues to this as to understanding how they're interpreted. The first form is darkness. Now, this may refer to the moon. And the second, desire. Well, you would expect that to be associated with Venus, but here it's associated with would be associated with Mercury, the sphere of Mercury, and we're using that same word again, desire, which could be thumos, which could be heat, selfishness, could be many things. And the third is ignorance, which should associate with Venus. Perhaps the two are reversed. And the fourth is the excitement of death. That should associate with the sun. The fifth, the kingdom of the flesh, which would associate with Mars. The sixth is the foolish wisdom of flesh. And the seventh is the wrathful wisdom. These are the 7 powers of wrath. And this means the avenging powers. And the powers are called, in the Hermetic literature and others, the avengers and the avenging powers and so on. So they asked the soul, whence do you come, slayer of men, or where are you going, conqueror of space? And the soul, and that's the soul of Mary Magdalene, answered and said, what binds me has been slain, and what turns me about has been overcome, and my desire has been ended, and ignorance has died. And so this is the end of the gospel. She has overcome all of the forces, the four worlds, of which the fourth world is a sevenfold world, and she is ascended to the eighth, we would assume the eighth heaven. Now, if we compare this to the Poimandres, the shepherd of men, not to be confused with the early Christian shepherd of Hermas, Poimandres tells us this: when the material body is to be dissolved, first thou surrenderest the body by itself under the work of change. In other words, you rot. And thus the form thou hadst doth vanish, your body rots away. And thou surrenderest thy way of life, your personality, the nephesh, the Jewish nephesh, the ethos, null and void of its energy, unto the demon, the elemental. Well, the demon means air, earth, and water. These are the elements that are part of the irrational nature. And the body's senses, which are now of fire, they next pass back into their sources, becoming separate and revive as energies. And this is very much like the concept of the skandhas that we find in Hindu and Buddhist analysis. And passion and desire withdraw unto that nature which is void of reason. That nature which is void of reason is chaos, the elemental chaos from which all things came, and that is the unreasonable, the irrational part of reality that we are trying to grow out of. And thus it is that man doth speed his way thereafter upwards through the harmonia, which is the harmony of the spheres. This means, of course, the perfected soul, the perfected one who overcomes all this. To the first zone he releases the energy of growth and waning. Now that's definitely the moon. To the second zone, the device of evils, the planning of devious things, guile and so on. This would be Mercury, the downside of Mercury. To the third, the downside of Venus, which is the guile of desires, nullified. To the fourth, which would be the sun, his domineering arrogance, and that would relate very nicely to the solar thing. That is also nullified. And to the fifth, which would be Mars, unholy daring and rashness of audacity. These are the bad the vices that are released and nullified and no longer hold the soul back. Unto the sixth, which would be Jupiter, the striving for wealth by evil means, deprived of its self-aggrandizement. This is the Jupiterian, the downside of Jupiter. And to the seventh zone, ensnaring falsehood, nullified. This is the evil Saturn. So these would be the seven spheres. The spheres through which the soul passes after death. The soul is now just the body's senses, reduced to their simplest energies. And then, with all the sidereal influences of the harmonia stripped from him, clothed in his proper power, he cometh to that nature which belongs unto the eighth. And there with those that are truly real in the Ogdoad, he hymns, or the soul hymns the Father. Now, I would maintain that it's something like this that we're seeing in the Magdalenic initiation. Whether this is something that is a Gnostic adaptation or a Gnostic total invention, or more likely it's related to Merkabah mysticism, to the Merkabah Ascent that we hear from St. Paul and others. As we look at the story told in the Gospel of Mary, we seem to have four olamim, four worlds. And these might correlate, as they do in the Empedoclean and Pythagorean concepts of reality, to the four elements. And so initiation by Yeshua may have taken some kind of form like this. We have four elemental realms: earth, water, air, and fire. Now, fire is the realm of the heavens. Earth, water, and air are the realms that contribute to the body. They might be somewhat analogous to Tartarus and so on of the Greeks. But there is the realm of water, the realm of earth, and the realm of air. These three worlds, in terms of their negative aspects, the parts that one has to be purified from in order to be released from, they then take back in death all that they have given you, and then you enter the fiery world, the world of fire. And that world is a world of the 7 divisions. And they probably are 7 divisions much like the others, but it is from that world of fire, or in that world of fire, that one makes an ascent, a fiery ascent. And so one goes through angelic beings, or whatever they are, that guard these realms. I'm using some different kinds of representations this time. And one ascends through each of them, and one has to be approved by each of them. These are the powers and the principalities and the authorities, etc. Now, if Miriam is being, well, the way it was put in the very negative sense was she was exorcised of 7 demons. That's the way it's represented to marginalize her in the later period that I referred to, the period of marginalization. Then she is going through these 7 powers, and she is being purified in some way from these 7 powers. Now, there's no way to really know whether these last 7 are something that the Gnostics have put in here as a 7-fold division of the 4th world, the 4th Olam, that we're really talking about the 4 Kabbalistic worlds through which she passes and is purified, or whether this was really part of the initiation of purification that she went through in learning the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, or experiencing them. But since in Luke's gospel it's made clear that Mary Magdalene is the one from whom YESHUA had exorcised 7 demons, I think that the 7-fold thing is probably very original. Now, it could also be a fiction. It could be something based on that 7 demons thing, possibly too. But I think it's more likely that it's part of the original gnosis that was present. Now, according to this situation, then, YESHUA would raise her through these realms, whether we call them earth, water, air, and fire or not. They're 4 olamim, they're 4 worlds, they're 4 universes, 4 states of being. And that she would be purified so that she would no longer, the forces and energies in these things would no longer have power over her. She would be a person who was in the world but not of the world. And although it's not clear whether she made an ascent, complete ascent to the Ogdoad or to the throne of God, we don't know exactly what it was because we're not taken to that point. It's clear that she was brought up through all that she would have to be taken through after death to achieve purification. She was brought back through this process, back to earth as one who had the status of an ascended saint. She was already pure, and she's walking on the earth in flesh. So she was bringing that heavenly estate back to earth. She was incarnating this new humanity, this new soul, this son or scion of humanity, son of man, scion of humanity. And so she was brought back into the earth perfected. The Greek word is teleos, or you might say shalem in the Hebrew or Aramaic. She's brought back as a perfected being. And her soul has been perfected. She has perfected her discipleship and her soul, and she no longer has within herself any kind of subjectivity and any kind of vulnerability to the negative and evil forces that usually run all of humanity and society. And that would be then this final initiation that YESHUA would have performed. so that at her death she would ascend immediately into the heavens. So Mary Magdalene is therefore one that we would consider to be the most initiated, or one of the most initiated, because we don't know of other beings who they might have been, whether the person in the Gospel of Mark is an ideal person or a real historical person, whether this is the Lazarus of John's Gospel, who is the brother, according to them, of Mary and Martha, or what. But we do know that Mary Magdalene is associated with some kind of very strong initiatic tradition. She was highly respected. She was old enough to be the mother of YESHUA. She died of old age just a few years after having been in Rome, according to tradition. So by AD 70s, she would have been an old woman and have passed away, and or even actually by earlier than that. And that John the Apostle lived probably at least another generation and a half or two longer than she did. So she was an elderly woman at that time, and she had been probably the age of Yeshua's mother at the time of his teaching.